Be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America that there is hereby created in the Department of the Interior a service to be called the National Park Service. The service thus established shall promote and regulate the use of the federal areas known as national parks, which purpose is to conserve the scenery and the natural and historic objects and the wildlife therein, and by such means leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. The Organic Act, 1916. With the establishment of the first few national parks and the subsequent creation of national monuments under the Antiquities Act, the United States was well on its way to developing an expansive national park system for the benefit and enjoyment of people from all corners of the globe. It wasn't until 1916, however, that one organization would be created to manage the national park units spread across the country. The National Park Service, or NPS, started small, but would go on to become one of the most recognizable establishments in America. Welcome back to RAC's Presidential Park Series, where we take a look at the Presidents of the United States through the national parks that honor and define them. Today we're discussing the Presidents of the early 20th century, including William Howard Taft, Woodrow Wilson, Warren Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover, a group of men who saw the country through a world war, the roaring 1920s, and ending in an economic collapse that would last a decade. But through all of it, the national park system would endure and continue to grow under their guidance. Without further ado, let's jump in. We begin with William Howard Taft. Born in Cincinnati shortly before the Civil War, Taft's main passion wasn't actually politics, but law. His father was a judge, and Taft aspired to ultimately become a member of the Supreme Court. Taft's formative years are memorialized at the William Howard Taft National Historic Site, which preserves his Cincinnati boyhood home. Taft would eventually become Theodore Roosevelt's chosen successor for the nation's highest office, and won the election of 1908, becoming the nation's 27th president. Taft dealt with several areas of policy during his presidency, but in terms of conservation, he oversaw the establishment of Glacier National Park in Montana in 1910, and established the Bureau of Mines to protect mineral deposits throughout the U.S. However, other actions from Taft, like firing Gifford Pinchot, the chief of the Forest Service, angered Theodore Roosevelt, and Roosevelt decided he wanted to run for president again. The election of 1912 saw Taft facing Woodrow Wilson, with Roosevelt running on his independent Bull Moose ticket. With Roosevelt and Taft taking votes away from each other, Wilson was able to come out on top, and Taft's term was over. However, it would be in Taft's later years when he finally achieved his true desire. In 1921, Taft became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and would serve for almost 9 years. Picking up with Woodrow Wilson, Wilson was born in Virginia but eventually worked his way up to becoming president of the prestigious Princeton University at the beginning of the 20th century. By 1912, he was on the national ballot for president and soon found himself in the highest office in the nation. Only a year and a half later, Europe broke out into war. Wilson initially maintained neutrality on the part of the United States, but after several incidents involving the U.S., Wilson declared war in 1917 and sent American troops overseas to assist Great Britain, France, and their allies to combat Germany, Austria-Hungary, and theirs. However, the year prior was a big year in terms of conservation. As mentioned at the top of this video, 1916 was the year that Congress passed the Organic Act, allowing for the creation of the National Park Service. This took the 14 existing national parks at the time, plus the spattering of national monuments that had been created since Theodore Roosevelt passed the Antiquities Act a decade earlier, and even included protected areas such as the Hot Springs Reservation, dating all the way back to the presidency of Andrew Jackson, and put them all under the jurisdiction of the newly created service. While this was an important step for protecting America's historical and natural landmarks, Wilson had a war to fight, and eventually helped Britain and France secure an armistice in November of 1918, effectively ending the war. Wilson wanted to create a League of Nations following the conflict, a precursor of sorts to today's United Nations, but the United States refused to ratify the idea, and thus Wilson exited the presidency in a world that wasn't at war, but in a delicate and uneasy peace. Wilson was succeeded by Warren G. Harding, an Ohio politician who had served in the Senate since the middle of the decade, and won the 1920 election by a landslide, getting 60% of the total vote. Under Harding, the nation entered the period known as the Roaring 20's, a time of great economic prosperity for many. During the Harding presidency, Hot Springs Reservation finally became an official national park, and all seemed well. However, scandal appeared to be brewing in the Harding administration, but before Harding was able to publicly announce information regarding the scandals, he unexpectedly passed away in 1923, while on tour visiting among other locations national parks of all places. This left Calvin Coolidge in charge. Hailing from Vermont, Coolidge was actually in his home state when he received the news that he was to be president. As president, Coolidge inherited the economic prosperity that had begun under Harding, and which would continue throughout most of a decade. In 1927, Coolidge visited Black Hills of South Dakota and gave a speech at the ceremony dedicated to the start of work on the now iconic Mount Rushmore, bringing the presidents and the parks full circle. It was while he was in South Dakota that Coolidge announced he would not be running for re-election in 1928, and it would be Herbert Hoover who would become the nation's 31st president in 1929. Hoover was born in the town of West Branch, Iowa, and his childhood home and town are protected as Herbert Hoover National Historic Site. Before he became president, Hoover played a massive role during the First World War, leading the charge in delivering food to war-torn Europe and earning a reputation as a humanitarian. He then went on to serve as the Secretary of Commerce under Harding and Coolidge before being nominated for president in 1928. He won the election, but there would be little time to celebrate, as mere months after his inauguration, the stock market crashed and the United States was sent spiraling into the Great Depression, a depression that would plague the country for the better part of a decade. Although Hoover struggled to deal with the depression, he did make a contribution towards the national park system in Virginia, an important milestone as most parks were in the western United States at the time, with Lafayette, known today as Acadia, being the exception. Hoover established Camp Rapidan, the first presidential retreat, which would eventually go on to become part of Shenandoah National Park, one of America's more popular national parks. Unfortunately for Hoover, his popularity as president was dwindling, and in 1932, he did not get re-elected. And this is where we end today's video, but join us next time when we discuss a president who provided a new deal for a country in shambles, and also gave a much-needed boost to the national parks as well. That's right, we're talking about none other than Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But until then, you've been watching RAC's Presidential Park Series. So long!